Hello, how are you?
Hello?
Can't hear you.
Is that you, Tatiana?
Can you switch on your microphone?
Can you hear me?
Hello, Douglas. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Well, I've turned my microphone. My microphone is on. And my
I can't hear you now. We will ask technician for help.
Hello.
We'd
I can
like to
hear
check
you,
that
but
everything is going to be fine.
can you see my slides, Tatiana?
Douglas, we can hear you on Teams, but apparently they can't hear you there.
Oh, I see.
Alan, hello.
Yes, this is Alan Schenke. Hello.
Hello, Anna. Hello. Can you see me?
Hello.
Can you hear me, Tatiana?
Yes, I can hear. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I hope we will not have any problems with the sound. Yeah, we have a technician here who regulate.
Maybe try again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, Andreas.
Can you hear me?
Hello, Andreas.
Hello.
Nice
You can
Hi.
hear me?
Hello.
Hello, Andreas.
Hello,
Hello.
Hi.
Real pleasure.
Richard. Hi, Alan. Hi, Douglas.
Hello. So can you hear everybody hear me?
I can hear you and see you.
Yeah, I think Tatiana was having a problem hearing me, I think.
No, yes, now I hear. The technician helped us. Yes, he regulated the voice. Now it looks nice. Yes, so Alan is here, and Andreas is here, real friend. Our journal, our university. Despite all the circumstances. Yes, you are with us, and that's great. Well, we also are going to have Sultan Governors. Okay, just a second. Yes, we had our coffee break started 10 minutes later, and now we will go.
We could have a mini colloquium.
Why not? Let's have a symposium.
Yeah.
Have you given your talks, Andreas, Alan?
No, I'm on at what is 3 o'clock in Moscow. So.
Is that 2 o'clock in Central Europe?
It's a 1 hour.
Yes.
1 hour difference with Central Europe.
Oh, I might be able to follow that then, because I'm teaching today, basically. This is a difficult juggling act we're all doing. And the other talks seem to be in Russian, so I didn't follow much of that.
No, I don't have any Russian myself, so I couldn't follow anything so far.
Now we're going to start our English plenary session, and I'm really very happy which we have renowned scholars with us, the national renowned scholars, Douglas Mark from here, Alan Jenke from Netherlands, from the University of the yeah, Andreas Mazel from East Anglia University, UK, and also we are expecting Sultan Devicius who's going to join us as well. So now I'm going to introduce Douglas. All of you, and we are very happy that you are with us. Thank you very much to everybody for accepting our invitation and joining us in this conference. So the first speaker, okay, with 2 seconds. Your slide, you can picture your picture. Yeah, you should please close the Teams window. Because now we can see your picture, we can see Alan Jenke, we can see Andreas model, but we cannot see your presentation.
Okay, so I've shared my slides with you.
Yeah,
via
we have
Teams.
them. We have them, but they are somehow behind your picture. Your slides are in the background. Yeah, now
Is that okay?
Yes, now it's fantastic. Yeah. Now everybody
Okay.
can see. Okay, dear
Okay.
guests and colleagues, once again, I would like to introduce Professor Douglas Mark Thompson, Professor of English Language and Translation in the Department of Political and Social Sciences, University of Catania. He's a very dear friend of our university, of our journal, associate editor of the Russian Journal of Linguistics, and you can find a number of his publications in this journal, which are available online. All of them are in open access. Douglas Thompson, a scholar who is interested in political discourse analysis, eco-linguistics, and today's presentation is going to be on this topic. Also, sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, pragmatic and critical studies. Okay, I'm not going to list all your publications. Yes, they are available online. Yeah, so it's time for me, I think, to give you the floor. Thank you very much again, Douglas, and you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. I just hope, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, it's good. Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you very well. Thank you very much.
That's absolutely fine. Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm honored to be with you and very for that very kind introduction. Thank you. So, well, I'm talking on pragmatic and functional perspectives on narrative in ecological discourse. And I'll be saying a few words about this emerging paradigm of ecolinguistics, which concerns our relation with the non-human world and the role of language in that. So I'll start by saying a few words about ecolinguistics, especially as it emerges from critical discourse analysis, CDA. What is ecolinguistics? I understand that in Russia it's not very well known, so maybe I might be saying a few more words about that than about other things. Some are relevant methodologies. I've got some data to show you and some conclusions to share. Well, I'm sure we all know that critical discourse analysis is an influential modern paradigm that emerges in the begins to emerge in the 1960s, a bit later actually, but in work in especially French linguistic philosophy, people like Roland Barthes, people were working, and also Michel Foucault, of course. This feeds into, especially into the United Kingdom in the 70s, 80s, and critical discourse analysis emerges. It becomes a very influential paradigm, especially thanks to the work of functional linguist Michael Halliday, whose work is taken up by many critical discourse analysts, including James Martin, one of Halliday's followers, who begins to talk in the early 2000s about the need for positive discourse analysis. So perhaps feeling that critical discourse analysis had in some way reached a high watermark, he wanted to move on and focus instead on discourse that, from our perspective, is positive. So discourse that identifies alternatives, discourse that promotes the changes in society that we want to see. So the idea is to promote discourse that encourages, that heartens us, that inspires us and cheers us along. And well, from my perspective, and I think from that of many ecolinguists, sorry, skipped on. Yeah, I would say that a lot of ecolinguistics can be seen in that latter perspective as an aspect of positive discourse analysis. Ecolinguistics really begins, as many things in UK linguistics seem to do, with Michael Halliday. In 1992, he releases a paper which I'll be saying a few more words about in a moment. Early work is conducted by people like Andrew Goatley, by James Martin himself, of course. Mulhäusler, Brockmeyer, and Harre in '98 have an influential book. Olwen Phil in the early 2000s is still going today, actually. And in the later period, up to our own time, Aaron Stiebe is a very influential voice in ecolinguistics. But let's think about Michael Halliday. So Halliday in 1992, seminal paper really, discusses the role of language in promoting an ideology of growth, or what he calls growthism. And an example from Sydney Morning Herald, so it's an Australian context. And you can see here the text is talking about the growth, unmatched rates of growth anywhere in the world. There's an optimistic outlook, air travel expansion, and this is driven by continued growth, and so on and so on. So fundamentally, Halliday says that this is typical of press discourse. This is his comment. Everything here and in countless other such texts repeated daily all around the world contains a simple message: growth is good, many is better than few, more is better than less, big is better than small, grow is better than shrink, up is better than down, and so on. And really in this paper, early paper, he's saying that this ideology of growthism is extremely harmful for the planet that we live in. And so this is really a primary signal that linguists are paying significant attention to ecological factors. And of course, that message, that emphasis on the implicit message of language reminds us of another influential work, that of Lakoff and Johnson from 1980, which is, of course, Metaphors That We Live By, where they are basically critiquing typical metaphors that we use, i.e., in their perspective, it's up is good and down is bad, which are their fundamental conceptual metaphors. And Halliday's work had his perception of growthism is feeding into a similar kind of stream. In ecolinguistics, this perspective can be extended to the stories we tell, so to narrative, to what Stiebe calls the stories we live by. So instead of metaphors we live by, we're thinking of stories we live by. And so ecolinguistics tends to focus on narratives that can be either beneficial or harmful. So Halliday is saying that growthism is harmful in an ecolistic sense. And ecolinguistics is about finding new stories to live by, replacing these harmful stories with potentially beneficial ones. So as Stiebe says, ideologies that can encourage people to protect the systems that support life. And these are discourses that we can call beneficial. And I would say that Aaron Stiebe is a second generation ecolinguist. He's one of the most prominent figures in the movement today. And he has this thing called the International Ecolinguistics Association, which I can say a few words about later on. And so this is from his one of his works where he's collecting reactions to a a poor performance at Christmas by Britain's retail outlets, so high street shops. They're not having good sales, but you can see how they're being reported: appalling slump, horror show, decline, etc., etc. They're reacting with the semantic prosody of catastrophe. So again, like Halliday and like Lakoff before him, we're focusing on this conceptual metaphor of up being good and down being bad. So we're responding to actually mildly disappointing economic figures from the point of view of the retail outlets in terms of total human catastrophe. And in Western societies, Stiebe points out, social media, advertising, governments, we all repeat this story that Stiebe puts into a few succinct words and uses a similar kind of capitalization that we find also in Lakoff and Johnson. So these stories are: the more you have, the happier you are, bigger is better, success is buying lots of things, spending brings happiness, and the economy must always grow. These are what Stiebe calls the stories that we currently live by. And of course, he's critiquing these and saying that we need to replace these and find more holistic, more environmentally friendly stories to live by. So yeah, apart from growthism, there's the idea of constant progress. There's individuality, which is a typical feature of Western societies. Omnipotent science, commercial freedom, life as a competition, and nature as a machine. And these are other myths that we're going to find in current discourse. And ecolinguistics, by contrast, is searching for ways of using language that tell different stories about nature, about the natural world, from those of the current industrial civilization. So stories that can encourage us to protect the ecosystems that life depends on. And very often in ecolinguists, we find these other stories, inspiration for them in indigenous cultures who seem to enjoy more holistic relationships with the non-human world when compared with Western civilizations. And examples from linguistic anthropology, people like Dudley and Gottlieb, probably in the next slide. All the species of nature. This is about Hawaii. So in Hawaii, traditionally, there was a community where humans, gods, and nature cared for one another and watched over and protected one another as family. So an example of the kind of story that we find concerning Hawaii and relations with nature would be this one. So if you meet a Hawaiian fisherman loading his nets and gear into the truck, you don't ask him if he's going fishing. You might ask him if he's going holo holo, which means out for a ride. You might ask him if he's going to the mountains. But if you ask him if he's going fishing, then the man will immediately remove his gear from the truck and stop his fishing for the day. The fish will hear, they know that he's coming, and they won't be there when he gets to the sea. So this is a typical story which I think evokes an idea of different ideas of non-human and human social relations. And a philosopher from Norway, Arne Næss, influential 20th century philosopher, talks in terms of shallow ecology and deep ecology. Shallow ecology is essentially what's going on, what goes on typically in Western governments at the moment, fighting against pollution, resource depletion. We're talking about things like differentiated rubbish collection, transition to so-called green energy. But this is still quite an instrumental human-centric understanding of ecology. So the reason that we're doing it is not because we care particularly about the natural world, but just because we're realizing that actually the quality of our own lives in these developed countries will suffer if we don't fight against pollution, for example. Well, deep ecology for Nass is a completely different perspective. So instead of thinking of humans at the center or at the top of some kind of pyramid of creation, we think of ourselves as knots in a biospherical net in which other forms of life, spiders, insects, birds, animals, plants, are in some way equally important, or if they're not equally important, they do have an importance, and we can venerate them as ways and forms of life. So it's a different position. It's a position which requires sensitivity and study, and also awareness of other ways of relating to nature. But this kind of philosophy, this kind of deep ecology, is the perspective that ecolinguists is ideally trying to work from. Well, from the methodological point of view, really, ecolinguistics doesn't have a specific methodology, as far as I know. I really don't think so. You can use pretty much any relevant linguistic methodology. What's relevant, I think, is much more relevant is the underlying philosophy and the aim of the study. In my own case, I like to use pragmatics because I'm interested in the construction of meaning, and I'm interested in probing the meanings that people develop when they talk about nature. I've always been interested in evaluation. This is also something pragmatic about evaluation. I'll say a few words about that. And of course, for stories, narrative analysis is highly relevant. And the model I use is an old one. It's the model of Leboeuf, but it's, I think, still quite relevant for what it can has to say about narrative. Whereas, as I said before, most of, I think, ecolinguistics for me counts as positive discourse analysis because it's a discourse that particularly attracts me and I find inspiring. So I'll just say a very few words about pragmatics, which we can't exhaust in a single slide. But pragmatics is concerned with understanding what is going on, understanding the construction of meaning. So how words have a dictionary meaning, but also in context they would have quite another possibly quite another meaning, or they can communicate several meanings, many meanings. And we fundamentally we work through a process, an intuitive process of deduction. Is George a good sailor? Answer: all the English are good sailors. So why doesn't Mary say yes if she means yes? Well, she does mean yes, but she also means something else. She also is implying other things which we have to work at to extract or to extrapolate. So, for example, the fact that she might be trying to diminish George's achievements in being a good sailor in a subtle way by saying that, well, because George gets this from the fact that he's English, that's what makes him a good sailor. So there are different implicatures that are involved in language, I'll move on from pragmatics and relevance, but fundamentally this is the bedrock of my approach. But I can't go into it much more deeply than that. Model for narrative analysis. These are different stages identified by Leboeuf: abstract, orientation, complication, evaluation, result, and coda. And these are not all contained in every story, but they are features that he identified of certain types of narrative. Evaluation is the way that speakers communicate their attitudes to the material that they're concerned with. So frequently positive or negative adjectives are included in this heading. The most complete, I think, account of evaluation is found in Martin and White's appraisal framework, the same James Martin who we mentioned earlier. But I'll come back to these things. I'm sure the pragmatics, evaluation are not new terms for you. So here's an example of a story about a tree creeper, which is a bird you might know. You might not have it in Russia. So just to show how the method might work. Jean says, I was lucky enough to see a tree creeper in the woods at Bowthorpe in Norwich, where I walk my dogs. Sadly, it went around the other side of the tree when I got my camera, and I missed getting a photograph. It's only the second one I've spotted in these woods, but I was thrilled to see a tree creeper. So Labov's narrative here, the orientation tells us who, tells us where, tells us what. There's always a complication in a story. So in this case, the tree creeper disappeared around the other side of the tree. Evaluation, the speaker's attitude to the material. So she mentions she was lucky. She felt she was lucky. Sadly, she was thrilled. This is the way that the speaker signals to listeners how they're to understand the story. And the result of the story is that she missed getting a photo. When I actually analyze this deep from a pragmatic point of view, I would explore that the significance of the fact that she missed getting a photo was actually maybe outweighs her sense of thrill and the positive idea that she was lucky, she felt thrilled to see. It's actually what she's communicating to her listeners. Maybe the message, the pragmatic message, is that it's important to photograph things in our society. So she could have posted it on Facebook, she could have done it on Instagram and so on. So these are aspects that would emerge from a pragmatic analysis of this particular story. So in my environmental data is taken from two contexts. The first one is this one, High Ash Farm, which is a farm in the UK near Norwich, and it's a farm run by a naturalist and nature broadcaster, Chris Skinner. And Skinner does a BBC program, The Countryside Hour. He's done it for more than 20 years. He just finished this year, unfortunately. But there's a massive backlog of podcasts which provide an important reservoir, I think, of ecological, potentially ecolinguistic data. So it gives you, he talks basically in this program, he'll talk about what's going on in the farm. So migratory birds arriving, badger cubs being born. He'll talk about ants, about flies, about goshawks, about anything really that's happening on the farm. And one of the stories that I find very interesting is this one about ants. This is a small part of the story. I'll just read the story for you. As I said, come back to the same collie. Why I'm talking about black garden ants, which fascinate me in many aspects of their life. They're very social. They will learn to milk aphids. So they'll stroke the back end of an aphid to exude what we call honeydew. You know, if you park under something like a maple tree in June and July, your car bonnet will all be sticky, and that's the honeydew which aphids exude normally. Well, ants learn to farm the aphids and stroke their rear ends. You get little tiny drops of honeydew, which the ants gather, bring back to feed the queen or the larvae in the nest. So this is the story that I'll be thinking about. You can analyze this in terms of its narrative structure. So who is the story about? It's about about you, but it's also mainly about black garden ants, aphids, the queen, the larvae. Again, when does it happen? Where does it happen? What's going on? There's a complication. There's the evaluation, a result, and even a coda. So this is actually quite a complete narrative, even though it's only, as we saw, only a short story. It has quite a complete narrative structure. Evaluation is something, again, which we can focus on here. So it's interesting to me that, well, Martin and White talk about at least two kinds of evaluation in terms of what they call judgment, which is assessment of behavior. So they're judging mainly human behavior, but in this case, we're talking about ants. So partly the evaluation is what can ants do? So the capacity, what are they good at? But there's also this propriety judgment, which is more of a moral or an ethical judgment, which is normally the way that we would think of human beings. It typifies human beings. So to apply moral judgments or ethical judgments to non-human actors, I think, is a curious feature. And so from a pragmatic point of view, I think even the fact that we are, well, Skinner himself, he's assuming that his listeners will share his understanding that actually it's worth paying attention to what ants do, that we can tell a story about the ants, which doesn't regard human beings at all, I think is an interesting fact. Also interesting is the fact that he's comparing them to the human species in a way. So he uses the word farming. This is a metaphor for what the ants are doing with these aphids. The strictly human activity of milking cows also is used. They're also learning, which these three things, to learn, to milk, to farm, are verbs that we usually apply to human behavior. So pragmatically, I would say that he's reducing the gulf that separates us from the non-human world. And in an eco-linguistic sense, this story can be seen as beneficial discourse. So in fact, he comments at another part of this same story that what most people would normally, when they see ants in the house, they would reach for the powder to get rid of them. Instead of this, we can actually try to see them as conscious beings that have a lot in common, or more in common than we might suspect with Homo sapiens. The second context is from Sicily. It's a place called Priolo Salt Pans, and it's basically a nature reserve near an industrial zone, a petrochemical plant, which was put, goes 30 kilometers of coastline in the southeast of Sicily, which has clearly devastated our local ecosystems. In 2015, the Priolo Salt Pans Reserve becomes really famous. It hits the headlines because flamingos have arrived. Flamingos have decided to breed there. It's the only place in Sicily that they do. And so if you visit the reserve when the flamingos are there, it's to see these wonderful birds against the backdrop of industrial devastation. And it's actually an extremely moving experience. So my story here, the example is a story from the director of the reserve, Fabio Cilea, and his father tells him a story. Well, this is a story about his childhood, which I'll summarize for you because I don't have time to go into it, to read it. But his father in Rome, when they lived in Rome, they had a stuffed flamingo curio, a sort of model, a stuffed actual flamingo had been stuffed and kept on a shelf, and it would fall down and hit visitors, and it was and every time that they would ask him, well, why have we got this flamingo? The father would tell them the story, and the story was that before the industrial zone was there, when his father was young, he would go horse riding. It was a natural paradise. And one year, flamingos arrived. The migratory flamingos had never been seen there. And a farmer actually shot one. And Cilea's father was really angry about this. And he went to see the man. He grabbed the flamingo, he took it away, and he kept it. And this is basically the story. And he would tell the story quite often. And in fact, his love for the flamingo and his care for the flamingo was in some way transmitted to his son, who became a full-time naturalist. Again, I go into the narrative structure, and just to mention just to give one analytical point about it before I move towards the conclusion. We can see that the way that the story is told about it, he says, shows the sympathy that Cilea has for the bird. He says, one of the poor bird's two legs. He's using the word bird, and this is important because by the time the flamingo has been transformed into what it is now, it's an object. You could call it a curio, an effigy, a piece, a paperweight, etc., an ornament. But he uses the word bird, and I think that's important. If you think of it being sold as an auction, it would probably be sold as a curio. So this, I think, gives us an idea of the kind of analysis that we can do in ecolinguistics. There are also cultural references in the story, so possible allusions to the crucifixion He uses words typical in a Catholic country, which would be evoke stories of the gospel. So the idea of trafiggere is the Italian for to pierce, and this will be a typical choice used by writers talking about the crucifixion, for example. There's also a cultural reference to the rhyme of the ancient mariner. So in the story of Coleridge's poem, you have the seaman who shoots an albatross, and then he's condemned to basically to tell the story over and over again every time he meets somebody, and he's condemned. And in this story, it's very similar, but it's not the farmer who suffers, the man who shot the flamingo, but it's actually the father of Chilea who has to keep the flamingo in his flat. And like the mariner, he has to repeat the story every time the children ask him. And in the end, he ends up by passing on to his son the environmental conviction that determines his career. So thinking now about a conclusion, I could have gone into this more deeply in a book actually, which should be out next year on the subject from Bloomsbury and on eco-narratives, eco-linguistics and narratives for shaping our responses to the non-human world. So narratives, we think, are fundamental linguistic cultural forms that have a fundamental effect on the way we relate to the non-human world. By studying this language, we can hopefully shed light on underlying patterns of environmental thinking. So I would say deep ecological wisdom, this is what we're trying to look for, that will try and influence and encourage the stories of beneficial stories to live by. And I think as educators in our research, I think these are values which we can certainly look to transmit, to pass on to our students. I think these are really, I hardly think we can do more important research in the current climate. So that would be my talk. Thank you very much. I would just like to take a moment just to talk about this course that is available to anybody. You can, if you're a teacher, if you're a professor, if you're a researcher, if you're a student, if you're a PhD, if you're a postdoc, if you're interested in ecolinguistics, then please do check out the International Ecolinguistics Association, which offers a course, online course, absolutely free. At the end of the course, you'll have a tutor you can interact with the tutor. You can produce work, as much work on ecolinguistics. You can ponder them. You can ask questions. You can watch videos, and you will have a certificate at the end of your course to add. And I hope you find it fruitful and interesting. So once again, thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Tatiana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Douglas, for, as always, an insightful presentation, which I am sure have encouraged our young scholars to look at the field of ecolinguistics as an interesting field of research. And I would also like to encourage the audience to read the publications, the articles published, the articles by Professor Ponton published in our journal, the Russian Journal of Linguistics. We have a few of them on critical discourse analysis, also on positive discourse analysis, and we look forward to getting a new submission on ecolinguistics, which Professor Ponton have already promised. Thank you very much again, and hope next time we will see you in person.
I hope so, Tatiana.
Thank you.
Really. Спасибо большое. До свидания.
Thank you very much. Ciao.
Ciao.
Okay, and I'm really very happy now to invite Professor Andreas Mazel, Professor of Intercultural Communication at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, United Kingdom. And I do believe that Andreas doesn't need actually introduction, as he is a well-renowned scholar internationally in the world, renowned in the world, and including Russia. I just want to share a short story from my experience as an editor. Once we got Andreas's manuscript and send it for review to a reviewer from a faraway university somewhere in the Urals. And a couple of days after that, I got a message from her saying that she is really very much impressed that our journal cooperates with such scholars as Andreas Mazlov. I would like to add that our review process is blind, so she didn't know the name, but she guessed that the author was Andreas Mazlov by his writing, by his style, maybe by his ideas. And I'm also proud and happy, and I feel privileged that Andreas is a member of our editorial board and also has been supporting the journal for years. Thank you very much again for joining us, and you are welcome. We look forward to listening to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Larina, for this very kind introduction. I have actually problems sharing my PowerPoint with you.
If you would like, I can share the presentation for you.
That would be wonderful. I mean,
Can you see the presentation? Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Okay, just tell me when I should switch this slide.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Very good that you asked me to send it in advance, which has worked like that. So thanks very much again for having me. I would like to talk about a project or a part of a project on understanding the body politic metaphor in Slavic language countries. If you could put on the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I am very much indebted to your university for participating in a survey which I conducted some years ago on interpretations of the nation as body metaphor, which in the end included more than 2,000 students in 30 countries. For Russian, your university, your colleagues and students participated in it and contributed to it. So thanks very much for that. The book came out 2 years ago on national conceptualizations of the body politic with Springer. And its main research question was, how do metaphor interpretations differ across national political cultures? Could you go on to the next slide, please? This research question has a kind of theoretical and methodological background in conceptual metaphor theory, which used to assume there are the early publications by Lakoff and Johnson, by Lakoff himself, then Ray Gibbs, that metaphor understanding is automatic and unconscious. This is based, of course, on the theoretical assumption that metaphors are primarily conceptual, but also on psycholinguistic evidence that conventional metaphor is understood as quickly and easily as literal speech. Gibbs and his group have done many experiments that showed that, both for so-called dead metaphors, but also for transparent embodied metaphors in everyday speech, such as more is up, life is a journey, a complex entity is a building, argument is war, etc. I'm sure you know many more examples. However, there is also counter evidence from further psycholinguistic experiments. In the first place, that all understanding processes are actually quite complex and have different phases. And the minimum seems to be 3 phases. One of the initial processing, which goes roughly in nanoseconds, but then during the syntactic and pragmatic further construction, further online construction, and then confirmation in the utterance context. And there is evidence that in some cases, in the so-called garden path phenomena, you do actually have to change your interpretation at the end of the sentence or the utterance, because it contradicts what you thought at first the meaning would be, and that also concerns metaphors. And there's also counter-evidence for innovative and comparison-based metaphors as not being as quickly and easily codable and processable as the embodied metaphors. If you could, next slide, please. There is furthermore critical evidence from research in second language acquisition, English as lingua franca, and intercultural communication, which points towards metaphor understanding not being as straightforward and uncomplicated as assumed initially by CMT. Language learners routinely make mistakes in understanding metaphors, to the point that they don't even understand that it's a metaphor at all. Metaphors pose well-known translation problems and difficulties, both in technical and in literary translation, and cultures can differ very fundamentally in assuming that certain formulations are metaphorical at all or not, which then throws up the issue of linguistic relativity. So basically the question of metaphor understanding is still largely an open question and cannot be dismissed as it was at the start of the cognitive approach as being an automatic and self-evident process. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Now, the project that I did together with a team from my university in Norwich, England, a few years ago, was to give a very simple questionnaire to students, asking them to apply the metaphor of the nation as a body to their home nation, to describe their home nation in terms of that metaphor. They were not asked about the conceptual history of the metaphor or anything like that. That would have been a completely different thing. So it was basically tested that they understood the metaphor in the first place as a metaphorical interpretation, and then how they dealt with it. And here you have in front of you one extremely creative, multimodal interpretation by a British student who painted a stick figure and then added ironical comments associating the arms with holding a cup of tea, and the feet for queuing, and the guts with having lost an empire, and the facial expression as being pessimistic and worried, and this being, as it were, typical of her British or English nationality. This is quite an exceptional case. Most of the other answers consisted in a few sentences or just mini essays to describe the writer's nation in terms of that metaphor. If we could go on to the next slide, please. When we looked at the more than 2,000 responses, we of course had a host of material which needed sorting, but we did manage to sort it into 5 main patterns or scenarios of interpretations. The standard one, especially from an English-speaking background, was to analyze a nation as a kind of anatomical and organological hierarchy in which all the parts of the bodies are interdependent, but there are some that are more important than others, like head and heart versus a toenail or something like that. There were also a group of answers interpreting the nation's geography as a body contour. So the borders were the contours of the body, and certain places, usually capitals and important places, were then given the designation as organs like heart and head, etc. There were a number of questions and a number of answers, and we'll see that they are particularly important in the Slavic, in the answers from the Slavic contingent, that the nation is part of a larger body. So an organ like my nation is a heart or something like that. Then a fourth one was the nation is part of my own body, written by the writer, which I designated ego. And the last one was the nation is a person and has a gender, age, family role, profession, etc. And we also looked for traces of humor and irony and explicit criticism in the answers. And what I'm going to present now briefly is an overview over the answers in these 5 categories or scenarios from Slavic language respondents. So if we could go on to the next one, please. Next slide. So here we have, if you like, scenario number 1, and I have given you the abbreviations of the countries in red and the examples. I will not go through all the examples because that would go over the time, but you can see them there. The Russian ones are always the first ones. So one would be, if Russia looks like a human body, then the head would be the people. You might think that it rules the whole body. However, the government is the neck, and the neck moves the head. This neck-head interplay proved to be one of the most popular metaphors among the Slavic language samples. It also features, however, in the Greek sample, and it seems to be related to proverbs in the Slavic languages, but also in Greek, that have nothing to do with the nation, but are about husband and wife. So the prototypical example is the husband is the head of the family, but the wife is the neck that turns the head in whichever direction she wants to. So this is a slightly ironical metaphor already in itself, and in Russian, in Ukrainian, and in Polish, the neck-head metaphor interplay is used in order to make slightly ironical remarks about a nominal head that is actually turned round by the more important neck. In the Serbian sample, the neck also appears, but has nothing to do with the head, but moves the whole body. You also have, quite critical, the government is an appendix. It's located in the body, but isn't of use for anything. Even more critical in the Bulgarian example, our nation has got many ill parts that do not function properly, which leads to total society dysfunction. So that's the first scenario covered, and already we have one very characteristic aspect for metaphor interpretation that do not appear, with the exception of Greek, in the other national samples. Next slide, please. Thank you. The next one is the political geography as a body contour. So here you have things like Moscow is the heart of Russia, or it's the brain, similar for Ukrainian. In Serbian, however, you have quite creative and to some extent politically controversial interpretations, like the lungs are the huge woods in the central part of Serbia, the arms are the connections that we have with other countries, and the heart is Kosovo. So that last point is, of course, a contentious political issue, and the writer clearly used the metaphor to express her political opinions here about that particular issue. Next slide, please. Now, the next group is that of the nation being part of a larger body, which at first sight you might think, hey, why should someone think our nation is part of a larger body? Is that actually attractive? Well, as we shall see shortly, it is extremely attractive both for the Russian and the Ukrainian samples. So they often have associations with the nation, with the heart. So we are the heart of the whole world, effectively. It can also be, as in the second example, the shoulders that show strength and beauty and ability to protect oneself and others. You also have then critical uses, like the one in the Polish example. Our nation wants to be seen as thick-skinned. We are not a pimple of the world. So, of course, to call a country the pimple of the world would be an insult. So this answer shows a certain defensive, arguing stance vis-à-vis such a possible insult. The last Croatian example says the people of Croatia are cute like red nose in cold winter. This is quite a creative, but also quite idiosyncratic type of answer. So that's also possible within that scenario. Next slide, please. This is the self as the body in question, and the nation is part of that body. This is a type of metaphor interpretation very much preferred by people who want to show a strongly patriotic attitude. So it's usually the nation is in my heart, or is my heart, or the nation is my blood and flows through my veins. But it can also be, like in the Polish examples, Christian values and traditions are in our roots and our legs. So there you have a kind of ideological, if you like, interpretation that is associated with this metaphor. Next slide, please. This brings us to the fifth scenario of the nation as a person, and very strongly represented. I'll come to the frequency issue in a moment, is the allocation to the mother figure. In the Russian example, in the Russian sample, the mother is also associated closely with the soul, and the soul with the heart, which we had a moment ago. So you have a kind of complex mother soul, and heart being used to express very strong identification with the nation. You also have that in the Ukrainian sample, but with the difference that the mother plays less of a role and the soul is more interpreted as a spirit, which is emotion and intelligence, and age and gender are part of the human body, which makes us a completed person. So that's more strongly focusing on the independence of the nation person. You also have that in Polish. You also find in other national samples masculine gendered personifications, so as in the Bulgarian sample and in the Croatian sample. In the Serbian sample, you then have another feminine characterization, which is not directly linked to mother status or motherhood. So that is also possible, although in the Slavic language samples, it's relatively underrepresented. Next slide, please. So here you have an overview of the, if you like, statistics of the survey for the Slavic languages. And I've highlighted a few points. The most important one is that the Russian and Ukrainian samples stand out not only from the other Slavic languages, but also from the whole rest of the corpus by allocating body part the highest frequency in their interpretations. This is absolutely unique. Then in the Russian sample, as I mentioned, this is very often linked to the mother personification, which is also very strong. Whereas in the Ukrainian, that is not the case, and it's more the body hierarchy interpretation, which is in the first column under body. Then you see that Poland and Serbia have extremely high body hierarchy interpretations in terms of frequency, and the rest of the scenarios are in a way ephemeral. This is interesting insofar as this equals very strongly, most strongly, the English-speaking interpretations of the metaphor. Then Croatia and Bulgaria, there it has to be said the samples are not really that big to allow strong statistical conclusions, but what you can see is that among these small corpora, the personification interpretations play a high role, so they are in the 30% category. The last column on the right gives percentages for the use of critical and humorous and ironical interpretations, and what stands out is the very, very low percentage for the Russian sample compared with the others. The Polish sample is so small that it's many, relatively many critical, self-critical characterizations of the nation produce a very high percentage, which is perhaps not statistically reliable, but it again comes very close to the overall most critical, self-critical sample in the whole corpus, namely the English-speaking, which has answers from Britain, USA, New Zealand, and Australia. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the answers seem to show in the first place, that metaphor understanding is neither uniform nor automatic nor unconscious, but highly dependent on pragmatic and social and cultural contexts. And these patterns of variation are discernible at the level of scenarios rather than at the level of individual concepts. The latter are in their hundreds and hundreds for some people, for some scenarios, so it would be rather confusing to try and define patterns on the basis of who calls what ahead of the nation or anything like that. The scenarios are methodologically far more manageable and informative. The conceptual range is almost limitless, so you have answers that only have head and heart and arms and legs, but there are many answers that go into the minutest details, like my nation's DNA is this, or my nation is a toenail off, or the capillaries, or even taboo parts of the national body. The textual range is of the type X is Y or X does Y metaphors, but also similes and metapragmatic explanations, which altogether provide strong evidence that most of these metaphor interpretations are not based on embodied metaphors, but really point out quite creatively a comparison and similitudes, if you like, in certain respects. And therefore, they are, of course, open also for ideological interpretations, and the vast majority do show an overall nationalist patriotic bias. But there is also criticism, as we have seen. It appears in most, but not all, these samples. The Asian samples, especially the Chinese, mainland Chinese and Japanese examples, have zero criticism and irony for these metaphor interpretations. But the Russian one had a particularly low one. I've just give you here one example of a Russian one interpretation. My home is like a spleen. It aches, but it's still a part of me. And the gender bias is strongly in favor of female and mother stereotypes in the whole corpus, but most prominently in the Russian and Chinese samples. One is that there is a strong cultural and linguistic history behind it, like the term motherland being an entrenched lexical item in Russian. Another at least contributing factor is probably that more than 70% of the respondents were female. So I hope this has been of interest. Thank you very much again for the contribution, especially of your university. This is the evidence I have for the Slavic languages from that survey. Thank you very much. And thank you very, very much indeed for the very competent help with the slides.
You. Okay, dear Andreas, I don't have words to express my gratitude to you for this really fascinating presentation on such an interesting topic. And thank you very much for being with us today. We really feel honored and privileged. Thank you for supporting our journal. Thank you for your friendliness and cooperation. And we do believe that one day we will have an opportunity to welcome you in Rodan University. Let's be in touch. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Spasiba, my one Russian word.
Thank you very much again. Okay, so now I'm really happy to invite our next speaker, Zoltan Jovicic, Professor Emeritus in the Department of American Studies in the Budapest University with, frankly speaking, a very difficult name, so let me just omit it. His research interests include metaphor, metonymy, emotional language, American English and culture, relationship between metaphorical conceptualization and context. And I think it wouldn't be an exaggeration if I say that Zoltan is a guru in the field of metaphor. His list of the publications on metaphor is really impressive. Let me name just a few of his monographs. Metaphor and Emotion, published in 2000 by Cambridge University Press. Metaphor in Culture, published in 2005 by Cambridge University Press. Language, Mind and Culture, 2006, Oxford University Press. Where Metaphors Come From, 2015. And his most recent book is Extended Conceptual Metaphor Theory, which was published in 2020, also by Cambridge University Press. So the list of his publications on metaphor is really impressive. Thank you very much, Zoltan, for accepting our invitation and joining us today. It is our real pleasure and privilege that you are with us. Thank you very much, and you are most welcome. Do you need any help with the presentation? Have you managed to
Sure.
upload it?
If you could upload my slides.
Okay, now it will help.
Yeah, I will share the screen from my side and you will just say next slide. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, thank you.
The floor is yours.
So we will do the same procedure that you used with Andreas. I will just say next slide, please, and then you
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. So let me know when I can go, when I can start.
You can start.
Okay, well, good day, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be able to participate at your conference, although it's only online, but hopefully it will happen in presence at some point in the future. As you can see, the topic of my presentation is metaphor and discourse, and I have chosen this topic for a very good reason. If you could turn on the next slide, please. The reason for my choice of this issue is that conceptual metaphor theory is commonly criticized for not dealing with metaphor in discourse, and that's a very true and legitimate criticism. I believe that the major reason for that is that conceptual metaphor theory deals with metaphors on very high levels of metaphorical conceptualization. If you think of such metaphors as action is motion and anger is a hot fluid in a container and life is a journey and so on and so forth, these are very, very high level metaphors, and I can only support what Andreas was talking about a few minutes ago, that somehow metaphorization occurs at a much more experience rich level. not at the level of action is motion and anger is a hot fluid and so on. So in this respect, I think I can second his general attitude to metaphor. Next slide, please. This is the outline of the talk. First, I would like to say a little bit about the communicative situation, which is badly needed and which is badly missed by most conceptual metaphor researchers. Somehow, for some reason, they are not terribly interested in the actual communicative situation in which metaphors are used. So I will say a little bit about that. Secondly, I will talk about the functions of metaphor. And as you will see, my main interest will be in functions of metaphor in natural discourse. The third item in the outline is that in order to be able to talk about how we use metaphors in natural discourse, we have to see conceptual metaphors not as high-level conceptual structures, but conceptual structures on multiple levels. And that's, in a way, a key idea. And finally, if we still have time for that, I just want to give you a brief idea how context and metaphorical conceptualization interact with each other. And that's essentially the issue that conceptual metaphor theory researchers do not pay enough attention to. And that explains why many metaphor researchers are so critical about conceptual metaphor theory's weakness of talking or saying anything interesting about discourse level metaphors. So next slide, please. So when I talk about the situation in which metaphorical conceptualization takes place, what I have in mind is the face-to-face communicative situation. There are, of course, many other situations in which we communicate, like, for example, us being online and we are several thousand kilometers away from each other. But the prototype that I have in mind is the face-to-face situation, which determines so many things about metaphorical conceptualization. Next slide, please. Okay, the first concept that I want to draw your attention to is relevant context. And this is a crucial issue in metaphorical meaning making because, and it's not only a crucial issue for, I think, and I propose for conceptual metaphor theory, but for anyone who is interested in how we use metaphors, even relevance theory. It is crucially important for relevance theory. Now, the metaphorical meaning making can be approached from two perspectives. In one, it is the hearer whose perspective is taken, and I believe that this is the view of most philosophers and psychologists. However, I am taking the opposite view on this. In other words, I am taking the perspective of the speaker, because it is, I think, at the end of the day, the speaker who decides to use a particular metaphor, albeit unconsciously, and not the hearer, which is indicated here as conceptualizer too. So if you take the perspective of the speaker, then in determining the relevant context, the issue or the question would be this: what is it in the present context that I can make use of to create the appropriate metaphor that the hearer can understand and will interpret correctly? I think this is the crucial issue, and we will see some examples for this. Next slide, please. Okay, in addition to relevant context, two further crucially important notions about the situation are the referential scene and joint attention. I am taking the proposal by Chris Sinha, who says that when we perform a metaphorical, when we make a metaphorical statement in a given situation, we are using symbols, and by making use of a set of symbols, we do that for with three purposes. One is that we want our symbols, in our case, metaphorical symbols, to represent a referential situation. Secondly, we want our symbols to express our communicative intention. This goes back to Searle's speech act theory, of course. And thirdly, we want to create a sphere of joint attention. That is, when I am using a metaphorical statement in a given situation, I am representing a referential scene. I am giving you an idea of what my communicative intentions are with that statement. But very importantly, and this is the third function of the use of metaphorical symbols, I am trying to direct your attention to the referential situation that I have in mind, that I am relating to in the situation. So that's what's called joint attention. Next slide, please. Okay, joint attention is taken by Herbert Clark, and he has a whole book on this, and I am using some of his ideas in the characterization of what is required in the communicative situation. So joint action is based on or assumes what he refers to as common ground, and the common ground can be two types. He distinguishes communal common ground and personal common ground. So in a given situation, we can assume all kinds of things that both of us know, and this can be something communal or social, and it can be something individual or personal. And that can all be, both can be the basis for creating and using metaphors. Having that common ground is absolutely essential for using metaphors as joint actions. Next slide, please. Okay, here is an example for the common ground. This is an example that I often give when I talk about this issue. I am taking it from Elena Semino. This is a quote from a newspaper article where the article is about a certain lobby group, GCAP, which is headed by Dr. Kumi Naido, an anti-poverty lobby group leader, and he is making a comment on a particular event in which the G8 countries got together to discuss poverty, but at the same time, there was a Live 8 concert, a rock concert on the scene, and when the anti-poverty lobby group leader was asked to make a comment about what the G8 summit meeting about poverty achieved, he said that they just had uttered a whisper, and everybody understood what was meant by the term whisper. He said it was just a whisper because in the situation, he created a metaphor in relation to the very loud and emphatic and powerful comment made by the rock concert that assumed that took poverty to be a shame of wealthy countries, and in relation to that loud comment, to utter a whisper is a very interesting metaphor that indicates as Samino puts it, the faint-heartedness of the summit to handle poverty. Now, this is a good example of how the shared perceptual experience made it possible to create a novel metaphor on the scene. Next slide, please. Next, let's take up the issue of functions of metaphor in discourse. There are several functions that metaphors can perform in a particular discourse, and two of these are what are called intertextual and intratextual functions. I will briefly discuss this, and then toward the end of the talk, I will bring in some more functions at the end. Okay, next slide, please. The function of one function of metaphor in discourse is to provide coherence to the discourse. And if you read this newspaper article or a part of this newspaper article, what you will find is that there is just one metaphor that runs through all this, and that metaphor is something like, life is a horse show. I don't want to read it. You can do so, and you will see that the entire paragraph or the entire article is organized around this metaphor that is human life, and what we are supposed to do in human life is compared to a horse show in which horses are asked to jump higher and higher obstacles, and in the same way, in our lives, in our jobs, we are also asked to do more and more, and so on. And so we can say that there is a single metaphor that gives coherence to this to this particular piece of discourse. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, this is what we can call a metaphorically homogeneous discourse. However, what we should note here is that such metaphorically homogeneous discourses are quite rare. Most discourses employ mixed metaphors. Now, this notion, and this is very important. So on the one hand, we have very, very homogeneous discourses organized by a single metaphor, like the one we just saw. However, it turns out that, this is exceptional, because if you read a newspaper, or if you read, magazines, hear stories, and so on, it's not the case that the discourse is given coherence by a single homogeneous metaphor. It can happen, but it's not does not happen in the majority of cases. Now, this idea was taken up by some metaphor researchers who questioned the validity of the claims of CMT, conceptual metaphor theory, which claims that there is simultaneous activation of source and target domains in discourse. And if there is simultaneous activation of source and target in discourse, then once you pick up a metaphor, you have to pursue that metaphor, as in the case of metaphorically homogeneous metaphor uses. But they suggest that this is not what happens in most of the cases. As a result, conceptual metaphor theory cannot be right, because if conceptual metaphor theory was right, that is, there is simultaneous activation of source and target, then we should not have mixed metaphor-based discourses at all. I am talking about the work of Shen and Balaban in 1999. Okay, so what can we do with this situation? Next slide, please. The idea of the production of consistent and homogeneous linguistic examples does not necessarily follow from CMT. Actually, as I just proposed, it's the opposite that usually happens. We should expect the use of mixed metaphors in natural discourse. And the reason for that is that once you have a topic, this topic that is an overall issue like human life, or anger, let's say, the target domain has several distinct aspects. And these aspects, and this is the key thing, all require different conceptual metaphors. For example, the concept of anger, as one aspect of it, has existence, another aspect of it, intensity, danger, control, and so on. And there are different metaphors dedicated to talk about all of these different aspects. So it is not the case that we can only use a single anger metaphor to talk about all aspects of anger in real life communication. This is an example that I found on the internet, which is a clear piece of evidence for the suggestion. As soon as you feel anger, start to build, take time to calm down. Another metaphor, separate yourself from the situation. A third metaphor, consider what the consequences of blowing up could be in that moment. A fourth metaphor. So different aspects of the concept of anger require different conceptual metaphors, and this is exactly what we can see in this quote. Next slide, please. Now, let me turn to the issue of the multi-level nature of metaphors. One of the major criticisms of CMT in general is that it is not capable of accounting for meaning in actual occurrences of metaphorical language in real discourse. And here is just a short list of people who have raised all kinds of criticisms along these lines. As I pointed out at the beginning, probably the reason is that CMT researchers work on levels of such high levels as the schema level, the domain level, the frame level, and so on. And the metaphors that we get and the metaphors that we like to deal with are decontextualized patterns in long-term memory. But this is not, what we actually find in actual pieces of discourse. Next slide, please. In real online communication, what happens is that speakers mobilize the static image schemas, domains, and frames at the mental spaces level. Now, my notion of at the mental spaces level is very close to what Andreas was talking about when he was discussing the concept of scenarios. He very early on talked about the need to deal with metaphor also at the scenario level, and not just with metaphors on such high levels as domains and image schemas and frames and so on. So here is an example from what I call the mental spaces level. The example is taken from the internet again. Everything that I wanted to say, I couldn't think how to say in French. I was bursting with anger, mostly at myself for my lack of French vocabulary. This is an American woman talking in Paris when, she is expressing a sentiment that we often have when we are in a foreign country. We think that we know the language of the country, but actually we forgot it a long time ago, although we learned it at school. And so she is angry at herself, for the poverty of her French. Next slide, please. Now, if we want to put the metaphor that she has just used, the American woman just used, in terms of in the format of a conceptual metaphor, then we have to say something like this. The high intensity of the speaker's anger is the high degree of the physical pressure inside the speaker container. Notice that this is pretty awkward, and no conceptual metaphor theorist would like to see such metaphors. This is too detailed, too content-rich, too much tied to a particular situation, and they would be right. However, we need it if we want to understand how conceptual metaphors actually work for real world usages. Next slide, please. So what we have is a very specific conceptual metaphor at the mental space level. Notice that the mental space level is the actual level that I am using online in the given situation, like this American woman, so that in this particular example, the role of the angry person is filled by the particular value of the speaker, that is the American woman, and it is built on a specific aspect of anger, namely its high intensity. If you remember, the metaphor at the mental space level is all about the intensity of her anger in the given situation. Now, this specific metaphor, moreover, is based on, obviously, it is based on a more schematic metaphor, more familiar, for us. The angry person is a pressurized container. This is the bursting situation. I am bursting. I'm angry at myself, thinks the American woman. And this, in turn, is an elaboration of an even more schematic metaphor: emotions are forces. In particular, it is based on the mapping of emotional intensity is the degree of pressure. And finally, this is a metaphor that also subsumes assumes rather the intensity strength metaphor, very high level metaphor. We would say that this is an image schema, or an image schema level metaphor, which is an aspect of an even better known image schema level metaphor, causes or forces. Causes or forces, of course, come in all kinds of degrees, and intensity strength is focusing on a particular aspect, the intensity aspect of causes or forces. So this is remarkable. What we find about this mental space level metaphor, that it assumes a frame level metaphor. The angry person is a pressurized container, which assumes a domain level metaphor, emotions are forces, which assumes an even higher level metaphor, what I call an image schema level metaphor, causes or forces, or intensity, strength of effect. Next slide, please. So what we get here is a clear statement of a schematicity hierarchy. This is a notion that does occur in the literature. I am not saying that this is my invention. However, most scholars only work on the top three levels, the image schema level, the domain level, and the frame level, and they like to forget about, or they simply neglect or ignore the mental space level. However, to my mind, and I would assume Andreas's mind as well, the mental space level is crucial here. I want to talk about, in the given situation, how extremely angry I am. I am bursting with anger at my lack of, French vocabulary. Okay, so this is an image. This is a schematicity hierarchy that includes 4 levels, and the levels are in a hierarchical relationship. And so this would change our entire way of thinking about conceptual metaphors as being on a single level, usually the domain level or the frame level. Talking about conceptual metaphors, at least of a certain kind, especially correlation-based metaphors, now we need to think of them as existing on 4 distinct but related hierarchical levels. Next slide, please.
Excuse me, Walton, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we are running out of time and we have another speaker after you. Could you please come closer to the conclusion?
Okay. Okay, I just wanted to talk about pragmatic functions of metaphor in discourse, but I skipped that and go to my conclusions. Okay. So, well, I talked about the real issue, the real topic of the discourse only tangentially when I talked about the French woman's metaphorical conceptualization of her anger in a given situation, but the suggestion it would still be valid that it is possible to provide an account of metaphorical meaning in discourse, like in the case of we have seen. However, in order to do that, conceptual metaphor theory needs to be changed. And I think in the past few years, there are certain sea changes to conceptual metaphor theory. In particular, we need to see many conceptual metaphors as being composed of 4 levels of conceptual structure in a schematicity hierarchy. Secondly, I could only talk about this tangentially again. We need to add a powerful contextual component to conceptual metaphor theory. And very importantly, discourse and metaphor primarily interact at the least schematic, i.e. the mental space level or scenario level. This is where metaphor and discourse come together in real situations of online communication. However, in order to see that, we need a multi-level view of metaphor in context. Thank you so much.
Dear Zoltan, thank you very much for your very interesting and insightful talk. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time.
Well,
we are most grateful to you that you have found some time to be with us, as we know how busy you are. And we look forward to our further cooperation. I just thought that you are the only one speaker out of 4 who has no publication in the Russian Journal of Linguistics. And I look forward for your submission one day. And we
I
do
will have one.
look,
I will have one soon.
yes, as a co-author, yes, but soon you will
Yes.
have one. Yeah, thank you very,
Yes.
very much for that. I do appreciate it, and we look forward that one day you to welcoming you in Roden, in Moscow, in Roden University one day when the
Okay.
situation gets back to normal. Thank you very much
Okay.
for
Okay.
for
I thank
accepting
you.
our invitation and being with us today. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, Alan.
Bye. Okay,
Hi,
and now I am really happy to invite our last speaker. Actually, I think I could do it in Russian, as Alan Ченки прекрасно говорит на русском языке, занимается русским языком, много сотрудничает с русскими университетами, с российскими университетами. Таким образом, наш последний докладчик, еще раз, Алан Ченки, профессор Свободного университета Амстердама, директор и основатель когнитивной лаборатории полимодальной коммуникации на базе Московского государственного лингвистического университета. Сфера его научных интересов – когнитивная лингвистика, невербальная коммуникация и сравнительное языкознание. В нашем журнале есть его публикации, поэтому, пожалуйста, я приглашаю вас их прочитать, они в свободном доступе, и скоро будет действительно еще одна. И сегодня Алан представляет нам результаты своего очень интересного исследования, которое, безусловно, заинтересует всех, кто занимается коммуникацией, невербальной коммуникацией. И, конечно, она будет очень интересна переводчикам, в том числе переводчикам-синхронистам. Спасибо большое, Алан, что вы нашли время, присоединились к нам. Пожалуйста, ваше выступление.
Thank you for the introduction. If I can just add a few words in Russian. Очень рад иметь такую возможность выступать сегодня с докладом в контексте фирсовских чтений. И благодарю Татьяну Викторовну и оргкомитет за это приглашение. Спасибо. And switching to English, now I can tell you about stance taking and footing in simultaneous interpreters' gestures. So I'd like to begin by giving you some definitions of the terms that I'm using.
Alan, should I share your presentation or should you do it yourself?
You don't see my presentation now? I'm sharing the screen.
No, we cannot see your presentation. If you'd like, I can share the presentation from our computer and you will just tell me next slide.
That's a shame because I'm sharing it right now. It doesn't show up
No,
as
you're not sharing anything.
Let me try one other possibility.
I can see you, we all can see you, but I cannot see your presentation.
Okay, let me try something else now. And now it's not sharing. Okay, so I guess I'll have to go with you are using the PDF that I sent. If you could do that, please.
Yes, of course, I will show the presentation. Can you see the presentation?
Yes. Can you make it full screen?
Yeah, you'll just tell me next slide and I will switch to the next slide.
Right. Can you make it a full screen presentation?
It is PDF, it's not PowerPoint, that's why I cannot make it full screen.
You can't open it. Okay. All right, then so let's go to the next slide. So just to give some background, I'm talking about translation and interpreting from a cognitive point of view. And if we think about what that involves, it involves reproducing in the target language the closest natural equivalent of the source language message, first in terms of the meaning and secondly in terms of the style. And if we think of this translation and interpreting as in general as a constructive process, the recipient and also the mediator construes some kind of mental model of what is being communicated. So if we go to the next slide. So here we see an image of a simultaneous interpreter working in a booth. And this is a very common situation where the interpreter is actually not being seen by the people that are in the room in front of her, but she is seeing a speaker here, someone who is also tuning in remotely, who is on the screen. You can see on the bottom right. And she's doing this interpretation, but you also notice that her hands are raised. She's actually gesturing while she's speaking, even though no one can see her. So this is a question that I'm going to come back to in this talk. What's going on with those gestures that the interpreter is producing, even though there's no one seeing her while she's doing this interpreting? Next slide. So to give some definitions here, we're looking at stance taking and footing. So stance taking, if we look at the work of Biber and Finnegan, involves several different factors. One of them is the degree of certainty about which one is communicating. This is what's called the epistemic stance. There's also the importance of the information and the degree to which this is in focus. So this is the relevance stance. And there's also one's attitude or affect towards what one is communicating. So this is another feature, another kind of stance taking. And if we think of footing, which is a different category that was raised by Goffman, that also involves three different features or categories. And one is what he called the animator, which is the person who is doing the speaking. He called it the sounding box from which the utterances come. The next slide. He also mentioned that in some cases there can be an author of the words who is different than this animator. So if you think of a political context where there is a speech being given and there was a speech writer who is different than the speaker. So the speech writer is the author in that case, the agent who puts together or composes the lines that are being uttered, and that might be different than the animator. And then the next slide. Then there's the principle. So if, again, we think of the situation with political discourse, there might be a political party that has a platform or a position that they're trying to put forth, and that involves some people which might be different than the actual speech writer, and that might be different from the politician who is actually producing the speech. So that group of the political party is the one whose position or stance and beliefs are being presented by the words. So this is what he called the principle. So we have these three different kinds of footings, as he called them. Next slide. It involves some people which might be different than the actual speech writer, and that might be different from the politician who is actually producing the speech. So that group of the political party is the one whose position or stance and beliefs are being presented by the words. So this is what he called the principle. So we have these three different kinds of footings, as he called them. Next slide. Goffman talked about this further and said that in conversation and in general in our experience, these different layers of footing can come together in different ways and produce what he called a kind of lamination. So lamination was kind of layering one on top of another. And Charles Goodwin and Candy Goodwin interpreted this as having presented a powerful model of how speaking works in different contexts, that we might be moving between these different kinds of footing. Next slide. If we think of this in terms of the interpreting context, Vanja Šimbrona talked about this, looking at dialogue interpreters who might then be interpreting consecutively in a certain context, or we can also think of this when simultaneous interpreters. We might also have these three different positions, and in that sense, the interpreter is also a complicated laminated speaker. Next slide. So if we think of who is doing the speaking, that's the actual interpreter. The original speaker is then the principal, the one whose ideas are being presented. But then who is the author of the words that the interpreter speaks? In a sense, it's a mix between the original speaker and their words, and then being interpreted into another language. The interpreter is providing those words. So in a sense, the author is a kind of mix. So in that sense, Vanja Šimbrona were saying this is a really interesting case of this kind of lamination or layering of different kinds of footing in a speaker. Next slide. So the question we can consider here is, how does gesture use relate to this in terms of stance taking and footing during simultaneous interpreting? So is it even possible to say which kind of footing is behind which gestures when the interpreter is interpreting in the booth and actually producing gestures? Next slide. So I'm going to be talking about the results of a study that was conducted at Moscow State Linguistic University between 2019 and 21, a project that I directed there, which involved interpreting between Russian and English, so interpreting both ways from Russian to English and from English to Russian, with 29 interpreters in that set, and then also between Russian and German, again, interpreting in both directions with 20 interpreters. Next slide. And what we had them interpret was a popular science lecture in each case. And so in the Russian case, it was from the website Postnauka, and from the English, for the English stimuli that they had to interpret, that was from a TED talk, so these popular science kind of lectures. And in each case, it was about biodiversity, the extinction of species. So kind of complicated topic, but being presented for an audience in a more comprehensible or more easily comprehensible way. In the case of the Russian and German interpreting, we used the same Russian lecture, and the German data came from the ARD Mediatek, which is also a site with a collection of these different kinds of talks. Next slide. The setup that we used involved an interpreting booth that's used for training in a classroom. And so the interpreter was, in each case, in the booth, and we used 3 different cameras to record them. So one is an over-the-shoulder camera, so you might see the tripod on the interpreter's side there from that camera, looking over the shoulder of the interpreter. Another was a small camera on the table in front of the interpreter. And the third was eye tracking glasses that had a camera in them so we could see what the interpreter sees. Next slide. So this is what we saw with the data that we gathered. So on the top, you have the image from the small GoPro camera in front of the interpreters. We get a great view of their hands close up, actually, in that context, as well as their face. The over-the-shoulder view on the bottom left, then you see how we can then see the gestures in terms of their use of space. And on the bottom right, we have the eye tracking view. So we're not going to focus as much on that today. We're going to focus more on the first two views that I mentioned. Next slide. With the data collection, we gave each interpreter a small glossary in advance, which had the words that they would need in the two languages so that they could get some specific kinds of vocabulary. And then in the booth, what's crucial is they only heard the audio recording of the lecture. So it was a 10-minute excerpt of the lecture in each case. They didn't see the video of the speaker, so they only heard them. And we did that on purpose because we didn't want them to be influenced by the gestures of the original speaker. We wanted to see what does the interpreter do themselves when they're in the booth and having to produce these utterances in another language. They were also not allowed to bring any notes or paper or pens with them. And even though that's artificial, we again wanted to see how they use what David Gibbon has called their natural media. So how they use their own body in terms of the interpreting process. Do they externalize their memory in any case when they're trying to do this task of interpreting? Next slide. This is how we analyze the data. We put it into the software called Elon, which was developed at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And this allows you to then see the video and then create different layers or tiers, as they're called, below the video, where you can then annotate different features of the speech or the gestures. In this case, we annotated 2 minutes of each video. We chose one near the beginning and one near the end. The reason being that with 49 speakers and each doing 2 interpreting sessions of 10 minutes each, we had a lot of data to analyze. So we just took a sample from each speaker for this analysis. Next slide. The gestures then we annotated in terms of different possible functions. So representational gestures, they might be depicting something in different ways. And here we used what Cornelia Miller called different modes of representation. So is someone doing something like they would actually do the action, or are they kind of molding something in space, or are they as if holding something? Are they tracing some kind of form with their fingertip, or is their hand actually being something and embodying an object in a given context? For deictic gestures, we looked at whether they were pointing in some direction or whether they were touching the desk in front of them to identify some time or space they were talking about. The pragmatic gestures involved these different stances that I mentioned. So stance taking, are they showing their attitude towards what they're talking about? Are they rejecting it and negating it in some way? Or are they showing uncertainty, maybe with a wavering hand, or emphasizing something with a beat kind of motion? For the adapters, we used 2 categories. One is self-adapters, which is when people are maybe gripping their own hand or maybe scratching in some way. And the other adapter involves when they were like touching the desk and rubbing that in some context. We also looked at whether they were using their right or left hand or both hands. And we also marked any noticeable head movements or mouth movements. But today we're going to focus more on the manual gestures. Next slide. So we had 3 teams of 3 coders each that were then analyzing the videos. So they were each given groups of videos. And then we did a consensus check across the teams to then see with this kind of second coders, did they come up with the same kind of annotations, or did we need to adjust our annotation in any way? So this was a way to kind of check and reinforce the reliability of our coding. The next slide. So if we go back to our schema here of these different kinds of footings, and then think of that in relation to the different functions of gesture, next slide. We can then think about who might be the animator. Well, it makes sense. The speaker who is producing and moving the gestures, they're the equivalent of this kind of animator footing. The next slide. And if we think about then who's the principal, the party whose position or stance is being represented with the gestures, that's another way to think of where are these gestures coming from? Are they representing the person who was the original speaker who was talking, or are they the interpreter's own gestures? Next slide. Then the author, this is a little more complicated. If we think about who puts together or composes or scripts the gestures, that doesn't really make sense in this context because it's not actors, for example, who were then trained in advance to gesture in a certain way. So if we go to the next slide, we can then leave that out for this purpose, and we'll just look at these two kinds of footing here, the animator and the principal, and see if we can tease apart what's going on with the interpreter's gestures. The next slide. So if we look at the different specific functions, and we let's take the representational functions first. Here we had a case where the interpreter was interpreting from English into Russian. And so she said what's on the top here. If she says, "Знаем, как выглядел dodo в этой книжке," so this is the dodo bird that went extinct. And as she was saying that, she used a kind of holding gesture or molding gesture there. So representing something holding this topic or the entity that she's talking about. Next slide. So in this case, if we think about it in terms of these different kinds of footing, the animator and the principal, let's go to the next slide. We can say, well, the interpreter is the one who was producing that gesture there, in that sense, the animator. Next slide. But then who is the principal? Is it the speaker, the original speaker that they're imagining? Who's the original producer of this gesture? Are they imagining the original speaker also made that gesture? The next slide. Or is it the interpreter's own kind of gesture? Or are they just doing this for themselves? And maybe it's really difficult to tease those apart. Next slide. Maybe it's both. Maybe we can't really say who is the principal behind this gesture. Next slide. If we take another example, here she was interpreting from Russian into German, and she was dealing with these numbers. So here she had 70,000 Arten per Jahr, so she's talking about the different species. And as she was doing that, she then with her finger traced the numbers that she was using on the table. So in a sense, kind of replicating what she might do if she had a pen there and she was writing them down. So in this sense, she made a tracing gesture to kind of hold that thought, as it were, externally. Next slide. So here, if we think about this tracing of numbers, that seems to really be for the interpreter. That's unlikely that they're imagining the original speaker having traced numbers on the desk as they were talking. Next slide. If we think of deixis, here we had a speaker, she was interpreting from Russian into English, again, dealing with these different numbers, and said 40,000 to 70,000 species per year. And here she identified two spaces on the desk in front of her. So she pointed to one, and then for one number, pointed to another for the other number. So it's a kind of what's called abstract deixis. So this pointing to ideas as if they're locations in space. Next slide. So in this case, this seems to be more likely for the interpreter. It's since the original speaker was giving a public talk and was standing up at a podium, it's unlikely that they were then making such small gestures on the desk in front of them while giving their lecture. The next slide. In another case, here he was interpreting from English into Russian. And so he said, "Вы видите то, что данные потери это обозначено красным на схеме." So here, while he was saying that, each time with the words that are highlighted in yellow, he then pointed upward and even looked to the side. But this is interesting because there was nothing there in front of him. He was looking out into an empty classroom. And as it turns out, the original speaker was also not pointing at that moment. Even he didn't see the speaker. Again, he was just hearing the audio. But the speaker didn't mention the graph that he was talking about being on one side or the other. And in fact, I looked at the video, he didn't even point himself. So this is really a kind of deixis, a kind of pointing that the interpreter is using for themselves, as if imagining what happened, what the speaker might have done. Next slide. So here in this context, it seems like there's a kind of imagined speaker. The interpreter is putting themselves in the place of the original speaker, and then that we can say that the gesture might be attributed to that principal who is imagined. It's not really what the original speaker even did. The next slide. If you look at the pragmatic gestures, we have a case where here she was interpreting from Russian into English and talking about 7 species of birds, and made this gesture with the 2 fingers together, which is what's sometimes called a precision grip, and then also had these kind of beats on it while she was saying that. So here in this case, we have this way of showing kind of preciseness of what someone's talking about. Next slide. In another case, he was interpreting from this interpreter working between Russian and German, then produced the utterance, wir können nicht sagen, ob sie aussterben oder nicht. And so here what he was saying, that he was also shaking his head and then put his hands up, palm up, and making certain beats, kind of emphasis with that. So in this case, he's showing a kind of attitude that goes along with what he's saying. The next slide. And then just to take one more pragmatic gesture, we then had some speakers who were making a kind of turnout of their hand as they were presenting different points. And sometimes if their hands are folded, even just lifting their thumbs while they were doing that. So this is what I'd written about on a paper 2021, which I called miniature variants of this palm up open hand gesture, PUOH, palm up open hand, which is well known for when people are presenting points. Next slide. So here, this seems to be gestures which, again, it's difficult to say. Is this for the gestures that the interpreter is imagining the original speaker produced? Next slide. Or is it the interpreter themselves presenting how they might express this if they were showing their attitude towards the topic? Next slide. Or is it both? It could be a combination of these. And again, this is where we see it's hard to tease these different kinds of footing apart. Next slide. So the final category, the self-adapters. So many of the interpreters were sitting with their hands folded, and many times they were making small movements, kind of gripping their one hand, fingers on one hand, gripping the other, sometimes rubbing one hand with the other. And these are movements and some considered gestures that are well known to help relieve stress or to help one focus, to kind of internalize, think internally about what they're trying to express externally. So with these kind of gestures, if you go to the next slide, it seems these are really the interpreter's own gestures. So it seems really implausible that the interpreter might have imagined the original speaker rubbing their hands while they were talking. It just doesn't seem very reasonable to interpret it that way. So it seems like these are gestures then produced for the interpreter by the interpreter themselves. Next slide. And then if we take this in the context of thinking that these are only in the case of hearing the lectures, then we can also say this is, again, a case where there's this kind of imagined original speaker. It's not about them just copying what they saw the speaker produce. Next slide. If we look at then the relative use of these in terms of the frequencies, in each case, both with the interpreting between English and Russian and between German and Russian, the overwhelming majority of the gestures produced were either, on the left side in blue, the self-adapters, the SAD category, self-adapters, or on the right side in orange, we have the pragmatic gestures. So these were the vast majority of what the interpreters were doing when they were gesturing. Next slide. So if we take our schema here, then we really need to focus on these last 2 categories. And this is interesting because then it reflects a kind of back and forth between the speaker producing pragmatic gestures, which are normally ones produced for someone else, kind of showing your attitude to someone, and the self-adapters, which are then known to be for the speaker, him or herself. Next slide. So if we take this topic again, and this kind of idea of lamination or this layering, we can see that it goes beyond the words. So part of what simultaneous interpreters are doing is representing the original lecturer's utterances. And this can involve doing what a lecturer might do in the given context of presenting their ideas, but it also incorporates the interpreter's own repertoire of how they speak and present ideas, including how they gesture about them while they're speaking. So if we look at gesture, we can really see this lamination and the kind of ambiguity involved in how to interpret, let's say, the principle behind the gestures that the interpreters are producing. Next slide. In addition, this is a whole dynamic process. So the kind of footing that the speakers are using varies and changes from moment to moment. So sometimes they're producing self-adapters, other times pragmatic gestures, and going back and forth. Interestingly, if we think about this on the verbal level, sometimes interpreters, when they make a mistake, they excuse themselves. This is not common, but once in a while they might say, excuse me, and then they say the utterance again in the way they wanted to say it. In German, Entschuldigung, we have some examples in the data where you see that. So in that moment, the interpreter is momentarily clearly being the principal of their own words, as opposed to the original speaker being the principal. Next slide. And this, I think, is interesting if we think of the dialogic nature of talk. If we go back to the work by Mikhail Bakhtin or Voloshinov, and we think about this, their arguments about how language itself is dialogic in nature, even when there's no live audience, like in this study, the interpreter is speaking for an imagined other, an imagined audience that's going to hear what they're saying. So this thinking for speaking and gesturing is inherently dialogic in nature, even when there's no audience there. And so the gestural behavior that we see helps reveal this, I think, reveals this dialogic nature, and also in terms of the stance taking that's involved, even if it's monologic kind of talk and monologic interpreting. Next slide. One warning, or sort of something to take into consideration, a kind of caveat here, is that there are big differences between the individual interpreters in terms of how they conduct their practice, how they do interpreting. So some of them were trained to interpret sitting in the booth with their hands folded and keep their hands that way and keep still while they were interpreting. And this one particular interpreter, unfortunately, I cannot show the video here, but he did not move at all while he was interpreting. It was quite remarkable. And many of the interpreters produced small kind of, self-adapter gestures while they were interpreting, but there was a wide variation. Some interpreters were quite theatrical and moved a lot when they were interpreting, and others not. So this is something to take into consideration. These claims are not uniform across all the interpreters. Next slide. So I'd like to acknowledge the source of the funding for this study, which was the Russian Science Foundation grant awarded to Moscow State Linguistic University. Next slide. And if you'd like further follow-up or contact, or if you have questions, I'd be happy to hear back from you. The QR code also links to the website that has more information about my publications and other works related to this project. So I'll leave it at that. Then thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, дорогой Алан, за очень интересный доклад. К сожалению, у нас нет времени на обсуждение. Я очень благодарна вам за сотрудничество, за то, что оно продолжается и что ничто не может этому помешать. Я очень надеюсь также, что вы сможете поделить немножко свое время между сотрудничеством с лингвистическим университетом и с РУДН, и мы снова вас здесь увидим, и тогда у нас точно будет возможность задавать вопросы и провести интересную беседу. Спасибо большое еще раз, и будем рады новым встречам.
Спасибо. Я тоже надеюсь,
дорогие друзья, я вас тоже всех благодарю. Благодарю за интерес к нашим замечательным докладчикам, за ваше внимание. И хочу сказать, что на этом наша конференция не заканчивается. Завтра у нас очень большой, длинный и интересный день. Завтра будут доклады в секциях, и вы тоже будете участниками этих секций. Я всех приглашаю, всех наших студентов, аспирантов, кто здесь тоже присутствует, присоединиться к нам, потому что будет очень интересное продолжение обсуждения актуальных вопросов лингвистики, связанных как раз с мышлением, сознанием, культурой и коммуникацией. Еще раз большое спасибо всем и ждем вас завтра на наших секционных заседаниях. И еще раз поблагодарим от меня и от вашего имени наших докладчиков.